Hi everybody, welcome to today's special event. My name is Alan Vallance and I'm the Chief Executive at the RIBA. Today's event, Disability in Design, What Makes a Building Accessible, is one of a series of events in the RIBA's Inclusion by Design Festival, which we're hosting in celebration of National Inclusion Week. If you've been unable to attend or missed any of our other events this week and you want to catch up on them or you want to tell somebody else about them, then I'm pleased to tell you that we are recording all of our events this week, and you'll be able to see them from next Monday by going to our website, which is at architecture.com. As an organisation, the RIBA is working hard to ensure that architecture is equally open to all, regardless of background or circumstance. Currently, it is not. We know there are discriminatory barriers which prevent talented people from studying, practicing, or even appreciating architecture. And we take our role in breaking down barriers and driving much needed change at pace very seriously. So we're using the RIBA's communications platforms, such as this one, to share an understanding of the key issues. Our Inclusion by Design Festival is providing an opportunity to learn from global experts and thought leaders on a range of topics, from race and gender equality to social mobility, LGBTQ+ inclusion, and today's topic, disability. Disability is a particularly personal topic for me. I live with a family member who has a diagnosed mental disability. I haven't lived the experience personally, but I have a caring responsibility for someone who has, who is, and who will live that experience. It's not easy at times, and the support provided by society for people living with a disability is limited, especially in an unprecedented time like this when we're coping with COVID. I'd like to thank you all for joining today's event. Whether you're on the panel or not, I encourage you to please join the discussion, share your thoughts and insights, make a contribution. We're all here to learn from each other. And now I'm going to hand over to the RIBA's Disability Executive Champion, Avril Chester, who's going to be our host for today's session. Avril.
Thank you so much, Alan, and good afternoon, everybody. What a week it has been. I'm Avril Chester, Interim Executive Director of Data and Technology, and it is an absolute privilege to host today's event. Disability by Design, What Makes a Building Accessible. Now you're in for a real treat. We have some incredible experts on our panel, and let me introduce them. We have Jean Hewitt from Buro, Happold, founder of Motionspot, Ed Warner, Access Consultant, Martin Burgess, author of Are You an Inclusive Designer, Julie Fleck, Consultant Artist Co-Director of DisOrdinary Architecture, Zoe Partington, Lesta Woo, an architect specialising in parametrics and complex geometry, Architects and Access Consultant, Jane Simpson. Now, it's a real pleasure to be RIBA's Disability Executive Champion. From a personal viewpoint, it's something equally close to my heart. My brother is autistic with special needs and he needs constant care. So throughout my life, I have been fortunate enough to meet so many different people with varying abilities. Now, we all know disability can happen either from birth or throughout our life. And having been through cancer, I'm experiencing how illness can then affect your ability. If I just pick on a very, very small segment of someone affected by cancer and those that have a stoma bag, walking into a disability toilet, for example, has a lot of stigma attached to it, yet they need somewhere very private to be able to change their bag. I feel very blessed and very fortunate. My embarrassing circumstances seem to be at the moment only in airports with very extreme x-rays where they think I'm smuggling things. But that's enough about that. I do have a little bit of housekeeping to cover, so bear with me on this one. As Alan mentioned, we are recording the session, and this is just so people that aren't live can view this later. We hope, and it would be extremely embarrassing for me as technology executive, that the technology will work today. But if we do have any problems, we will continue. And if it becomes impossible, we will contact all of you to reschedule. The event will be a 45-minute panel discussion and then an opportunity for questions and answers. We will get through as many answers and questions as we possibly can within the timeline. I'm going to give a very hard stop at 1 o'clock. So we're absolutely delighted to welcome the panelists, and we're going to get started. Each of the panelists are going to discuss accessibility from their experience of best practice and provide helpful tips and resource. We're going to be starting with Lesta. Lesta, over to you.
Hi there. Sorry for the fact that you can't see my face. I'm having technical issues at my end. But anyway, yes, I'm Lesta, and I'm an architect specialising in parametrics, and I have a structural engineering background too. I've worked for reputable companies such as Rogers, Stirk, Harbour and Partners and Wilkinson Eyre Architects. I'm also visually impaired, but don't be fooled by my disability. I have more vision than most. So firstly, I'm going to say I hate the title of this talk. What makes a building accessible? Like, the idea of a person going into a building and using it for its intended purpose is so profound. Surely function is one of the basic principles of designing space. What the title really means is what makes a building accessible to disabled people, because we as a profession are failing or making mistakes, afterthoughts that are being noticed. We are creating architecture that doesn't function well, especially for those suffering with impairment. And there are over 14 million people in the UK who are disabled. That's approximately 21% of the population. That's a very large amount of people to have as an afterthought. Architecture has to adapt. So instead of thinking what makes a building accessible, why don't we say what makes a building well designed for everyone? So you're probably a bit curious about me. I seem so weird and unusual. Why am I even here? Well, here are some stats for you. Out of approximately 40,000 architects in the UK, 27% are female. I'm one. 6% are BAME or BIPOC. I am one of those two. And 0.00025% are disabled, specifically with visual impairment. That's me. So you're right, I am unusual. I mean, with these odds, I probably shouldn't exist, but I do. I'd like to share with you some stories, and I'll let you sit with each one. So when I was working on Singapore Gardens by the Bay, I was known as Superdry Girl at the time. A colleague of mine said on a Friday night beer session, you know, women don't usually work on such technical projects. You are very lucky. You have such a masculine mind. You really think like a guy. Another time, I met a consultant for the first time in a meeting after many telephone and email correspondences. He said to me, you know, you speak so well. I definitely thought you were British. Are you mixed or something? There's got to be some white in you. I don't have many stories of disability, as I've always hidden it. Yeah, that's right. For those who are thinking I've got positions in my jobs because I'm a token or part of the quota, no, my colleagues have never known. I first started to lose my sight when I was 19. I was a Part 1, I freaked out, didn't know what to do, and I went to my tutor to ask for help. Her response was, maybe consider quitting. And that was it. I was very upset at the time, but as you can see, I just carried on. I continued blindly, graduated, fully qualified, competed for jobs, positions, projects, alongside the abled, all without help and acknowledgement. It was a struggle. But it was my choice to keep it hidden, but I felt it was my only choice to survive in my profession. The reasons are many. The concept of a blind architect is so taboo and nonsensical. The fear of being denied opportunity, of unemployment, of not being accepted. People question my ability all the time anyway, because I'm a woman, I'm Asian. The fact I look extremely young, even though I have 20 years of experience in the industry, and even my size. I can't hide these things, but with my sight loss, I sort of have the option, and I took it. So my last story is about when I went to the Apple store with my friend who works at Foster's. I was particularly blind at that point, and what happened was that I couldn't get down the stairs because it was so confusing. It actually made me feel physically sick. And then I went on a rant about why it was so poorly designed and what should have been done for an hour. He listened quietly and took notes and said, "It's taken a lot of time, effort, money to do that stair, and you've ripped it apart in 5 minutes. It's crazy. You're like a super designer, the daredevil of architecture." But, you know, the thing is that I'm not a superhuman or genetically modified to design better. I don't have the brain of a man, nor the heart of a white person, nor am I gifted with second sight. I'm cut from the same cloth as every architect, every human. If I've done a good job, that's because I've done a good job, regardless of my gender, ethnicity, sexuality, background, or disability. But what I do have is both design and lived experience. I feel real empathy when I design and apply my knowledge. That is key. That is the key to all of this. No able person will ever understand what it's like to be impaired. It doesn't matter how learned you are, a doctor, a scientist, an access consultant. If you are able, you will never truly understand because you have not lived with it, and that's a fact. And any disabled-bodied person is seen as incompetent and defective in the profession. And here we are. We have a dichotomy of preconceptions. John Amici yesterday talked about the racist hand dryers yesterday and how it was a severe afterthought, which didn't consider darker-skinned people, as all the designers were white. And an afterthought can be as bad as malice. Well, it's the same thing here. How can spaces be truly designed well when 99% of the architectural profession are abled and don't really listen to the disabled? There will always be afterthoughts. So what makes a building well designed for everyone? I think a good starting point is to be open to inclusion, to be willing to listen, learn, and empathize with different people and their needs other than yourself. Diversity in a design team brings a wealth of creativity to the table, and the architecture produced will no doubt reflect that.
Thank you very, very much, Lesta. For that, I'm going to be handing over to Jane.
Good morning. Was it afternoon? No, it's afternoon now, isn't it? Just want to say firstly, thank you to Lesta for your insight. And I have to say, we do need to encourage more people with disabilities to become architects, and also more architects like myself to become access consultants, because we do need more professionals who understand what inclusion is actually about. Now, I just want to set the scene for the rest of the panel. In the UK, we have a variety of legislative responsibilities that reflect directly upon discrimination and equality. And these have particular relevance to architects when it comes to assessing designs. The most relevant for me is the 2010 Equality Act, but also the Regulatory Reform Order, which seems to get missed off quite a lot. It must be understood that the Equality Act is a civil rather than a building-led legislation, and it's the activity that falls under the Act, not the building. The building either enables or disables a person from accessing services or employment, and there is no technical guidance to advise on how to comply, which we hate that word, with the Equality Act in terms of the built environment. The legislative responsibilities are based upon quite a few factors, including the ability to pay, reasonableness, and for public bodies, there is the public sector duty. And there are 9 protected characteristics under the legislation as well. So why is an inclusive environment important today? We all know we are an ageing population, and it's a major factor in disability statistics. By the year 2037, people over the age of 85 are projected to account for 5% of the population. This is 2.5 times increase since 2012, with those over 65 accounting for nearly a quarter of the population. And as a 58-year-old, I can tell you my things are sort of slowly depreciating and getting slowly and slowly more disabled as the days go by. And they reckon 1 in 4 people have a friend or a relative with a disability. None of us are average. We all age, are tall, short, fat, thin, and have children who will affect our needs, influencing our demands, and many will experience temporary disabilities. In the UK, disabled people have a disposable income of, and I'd got it wrong, but Julie put me right, of 249 billion. That's a hell of a lot of money. Any architect or designer has a professional responsibility to provide advice on the requirements of this legislation, while it is the service provider and employer who ultimately bear responsibility under the Act, but it is crucial for us as designers to actually get that right for now and in the future. And it's a misnomer to say that inclusion is expensive. It may cost a little more, but the added benefits far outweigh the additional expenditure. The problem is that budgets for many projects are being squeezed, and many buildings are being built ignoring inclusive design without any consideration of the implications this may have for the future. It's often heard that inclusion and accessibility is too expensive. Is this truly the case? The main question should be, what will it cost if we do not make the environment inclusive? In my view, it will lead to reduced revenue, negative publicity, loss of customers, decreased employment pool, litigation, and potential further adaptations. There are many factors that determine the way in which the building, premises, or environment is built, commissioned, altered, and operated. What is important is to consider inclusion at the inception of a project. Increasingly, many believe that having good access advice at the start of a project is an expense they cannot afford. Actually, the reverse is the case. Good advice can rationalise the access strategy, reducing unnecessary work, preventing late design changes, minimising the threat of legal action, and averting costly alterations. Recent changes to the RIBA plan of work have incorporated inclusion throughout. This is a welcome addition, and the following speakers will lead us through the sequential journey of a project from briefing, design, construction through to operations. They will identify areas which are pertinent to inclusion, with care, where care should be taken to assure inclusivity, and the benefits of an inclusive environment suitable for all. I will now hand you over to Zoe Partington.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to speak today at this event. And I'll just say I am visually impaired, so if I keep looking very close to the screen, it's because I'm just trying to catch all the clues. Okay, so the key, what makes a building accessible? I think it's about having the knowledge of how a disabled person engages with built space and architecture. You know, what makes this building work for disabled people? I think Lesta was explaining that quite clearly, and what practical intellectual design considerations are required. This is far more than just about functionality, legislation or guidance. It's much more than just being an add-on or a bolt-on, or an architectural team needs to understand more in-depth theory that actually includes disabled people. One of those things is called the social model of disability. Some of you may be very familiar with this, but it's a tool for new thinking, even though it's been around probably for 30 or 40 years, and understanding about the history of exclusion. One of the reasons I'm talking about this quite a lot is because, you know, how barriers manifest themselves can sometimes seem accidental, they can be historical, or they can be due to not knowing what the barriers are. But whatever they are, they continue to exclude disabled people from public view and the public realm and public transport, and continue to segregate and really isolate disabled people. At a higher level, not enabling disabled people to have access to the decision-making centres to make changes happen continues to exclude disabled people. So we just continue to perpetuate excluding the people that we want to have this information from. I can speak really generally about design solutions embedded into the built environment, but these have been around for a very long time. They're available to everyone. There are specific guidance and solutions in place. But from my personal experience, the lack of understanding about disability culture and practical application of solutions still remains that these concepts are completely and intellectually flawed, and it prevents progress from happening. Solutions often intersect across impairment groups. For example, creating a space with materials that acoustically make it quieter aid not only people that are deaf or people that are deaf-blind or older people or neurodivergent people, but I think it actually works for everyone. And I think everybody's probably saying this, but I think the clattering cafe syndrome, we've all been there, we all know about it. I think what we need to understand is about the conflicts that may occur as well. So it may be that in thinking about wider solutions, we need to understand what these conflicts are. So in the theory of shared space, it's superb. It's a fantastic conceptual idea. But for blind and partially sighted people, it can be incredibly difficult because you remove the clues. So if the curb is removed, you remove the clues to where the edge of the highway is. But at the same time, removing the curbs makes it fantastic for wheelchair users. So we have to work in quite a clever way to be able to really include everyone. And I think people have said this before. What we need to do is to listen to disabled people and build on their thinking. But you need to listen to disabled people, disabled experts, and have them present at the table. Inclusivity, what does this actually mean? And how do we approach this collaboratively? The best design approach sets out to include as many people as possible. I hope no one designs with the intention of building a building that actually would exclude people. That would be unthinkable in contemporary concepts and thinking. In design terms, we do need to consider inclusive design and break down unnecessary barriers and exclusions. In doing so, we will often achieve unexpected and innovative design solutions that actually benefit us all. There are examples in airports. You know, people that need to bring luggage and travel through those airports need the space, but also wheelchair users need the space. People with mobility impairments need the space, and people with guide dogs need the space. So there are all sorts of reasons why we need to do this and not just focus on disabled people. It is much wider than that. One of the other objectives of my talk is to offer recommendations concerning the needs of our disabled population as a whole, and more specifically, my insights, and no pun intended, as I'm visually impaired, are foremost concerned with the needs of people who are blind or partially sighted. And in addressing their requirements, designers and architects, planners and building managers will frequently improve the quality of the built environment for all of us, not just that specific group. And I think we need to really work on not just focusing on specific groups, but really widening this spectrum. I do come from a very authentic space as a professionally visually impaired person. I'm not a professional architect, but I'm somebody that uses buildings. I am somebody that has several impairments, too long to list really. But I think what's really important is to have disabled people that are experts as part of those teams. So we are together, we can make fantastic adjustments and designs and solutions. Nearly 20 years ago, I was very fortunate to work with Peter Barker. Some of you may know about Peter Barker and his work in the Joint Mobility Unit at the Royal National Institute for Blind People. It was a partnership between RIBA and guide dogs. And I remember him saying, "We are so accustomed as people to tolerating poor design that it is only when relevant facilities are diminished that some design shortcomings stand fully revealed. The overall objective should be for design any building or in any environment in such a way that all people, including people with visual impairments, can move around as independently, as freely as they would like to. These fundamental issues need to be understood and incorporated from the very beginning of the design process." And I think other people have said that it's being at the table. It's not being hidden away or out of sight. And I think when we're talking about these things, you know, in the past, we've talked about architecture for the disabled, but this actually is quite disabling in itself. And I think there are some real common factors that cross disabled people and would make it relevant for people to start thinking in a slightly different way. So generally, we disabled people, we're not at the design table, we're not at the planning table, and we're certainly not at that commissioning table. Disabled people are not in our architecture schools or in our design schools, and the tutors are not disabled. But if they are, we're still breeding a culture where people feel uncomfortable about being honest about this. So I think we need to start looking at the cultures within these institutions and breaking down the issues that bar people from being open and being honest and not feeling that they have to hide their impairment. I, as a visually impaired person or a person with other disabilities, I've decided not to hide any of these things. I'm quite radical. I will approach people. I want to go with people that want me. I don't want to work with people that don't want me. And it's their loss, not mine. I think it's really important that we start thinking about this in a very different way. Of course, I have at least 30 years of experience and I could talk for quite a long time, but we have a very short time today, I know. So I think what I'd like to do now is just to move to my conclusions. And I'm repeating myself because I think it's important that people take this on. But I think what needs to happen is that design teams, architectural teams, organisations and the built environment sector, they need to think about deeper changes within our institutions. Disabled people need to be represented much more in architecture schools and in the sector. The other thing that we need to do is to evaluate accessibility and inclusion. We need to ask people that use those buildings, not what works, what doesn't work. And we need to find out properly what doesn't work and act on it, collect the data, act on it. It's a needs analysis. It's not difficult. We also need to think about disability action planning. This should be built into every organisation, every institution, every design team, and at every table. I think it's really important. And the other thing that we need to do is to make sure that disabled experts are in these teams and they work with our allies. I think it's really important. Disabled people can't do this on their own. We need to work together. And I would really, really push and promote that. But I do think over the last 20 years, we've seen some incredible work happening. And because I've been fortunate to travel all around the world and to see the piece that Lesta was talking about in Singapore, some of those things are amazing, but we have a lot further to go. And I think it's really, really important that we continue to develop and continue to progress, but also celebrate the really fantastic things that have happened in the past. Thank you.
Jane, Zoe, incredibly powerful, and I couldn't agree with you more. And what a start to the panel. I'm going to be handing over to Ed next. Thank you, Ed.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me as part of the panel. I'm Ed Warner, founder of the accessible design business Motionspot, and I'm also the government accessible champion for the design of products and spaces. So delighted to be part of today and just so pleased to see the popularity of this event during RIBA Inclusion Week. I'm going to take just a few minutes today to explain what an accessible building means to me. And I wanted to start by just reinforcing the message that Lesta gave earlier, that an accessible building is only accessible if it's been designed inclusively for everybody. And whilst this seems like a simple point, what we see often in the industry is architects designing spaces that deliver for anyone with a physical impairment, in particular wheelchair users. And whilst this is a particularly good starting point, the reality is that only 6% of disabled people are wheelchair users. So we very much encourage clients to think about what are they doing to design spaces to accommodate the needs of the 94% of people with other physical impairments or a cognitive or sensory impairment, and in particular neurodiversity. As accessible designers, our team at Motionspot works with clients and their architects to really pore over design detail and encourage them to think about how the design of their buildings can be designed inclusively for everybody. And I wanted to take just a few minutes to explain some of the key design principles that we like to embed in developments. And I wanted to use the experience of someone's journey to an office and navigation through that space. If we imagine arriving at a big office block somewhere in the UK, we know that many offices look very similar in terms of the facade that they have. Often the same materiality is used on the facade of the building, often heavy areas of glass that can be very reflective. And it can so often be very complicated for people to navigate where the main entrance is. And what I'd encourage designers to think about is they've got as much responsibility thinking about the design of the exterior environment as the interior. So think about use of materials, use of colour to really define where that entrance is, which is particularly helpful for someone with a cognitive or a visual impairment. Try wherever possible not to specify revolving doors. I, for one, get particularly confused by revolving doors, and I know many disabled people do as well. So try and get away from revolving doors. And think about small design features like the floor matting that's used within the reception area. Shouldn't be a dark mat that could potentially appear as a step or a hole for somebody with a visual or a cognitive impairment. We always consider the design of the environment when someone enters the interior, so giving people some lobby space to be able to compose themselves before navigating into what can often be a very loud and noisy atrium is really important. So thinking about seating, thinking about good use of biophilia, thinking about the design of the lighting and acoustics to better meet the needs of everybody is particularly important. And a small point, but designers get fixated by large areas of glossy floor surface that again is particularly confusing for someone with a visual impairment who may perceive the area to be wet from the reflection of the floor surface. obvious principles like thinking about design of reception desks to suit both ambulant as well as wheelchair users or anyone short of stature is important. And I just wanted to touch on the importance of the design of open plan offices. We're working on a fascinating project with Barclays Bank at the moment to better design their offices to suit employees with autism, and thinking about the position of the desk, thinking about the type of patterns used on the floors and the walls, the lighting and acoustics, as well as thinking about some designated quiet spaces is really important. And particularly for Barclays, we're planning recalibration rooms that just enable people to take a step out of the office, away from their busy day, and just be able to recalibrate as part of their working day. I just wanted to just finish and talk about one of my biggest bugbears, and that is the poor design of wheelchair accessible toilets in public spaces and accessible buildings. And I wanted to flag the point that so many times architects drag and drop the same doc impact from design to design. And what happens is the accessible spaces, whilst potentially being adhering to relevant access standards, they are very much second best in their design versus the rest of the building. And I'd really encourage architects and designers to think really carefully about how they can be specifying better quality products that are more universally designed so that accessible spaces can look as beautiful as any other spaces within the building. So those are my three key takeouts as part of this panel discussion. Think about who you're designing for. Think about those softer features that can be designed into a building to make it accessible. And really, let's push the boundary around the design of accessible products and incorporate them into the design of our buildings. And if we can achieve those three things, we'll have buildings that stand the test of time and buildings that are really beautifully accessible for everyone. Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Jean Hewitt and I'm a Senior Inclusive Design Consultant with Buro Happold. Delighted to be here today. I'm also, I should mention, a part-time lecturer at UCL where I deliver an MSc module on designing inclusive places. And one of the really exciting things for me is to see architects and engineers coming through that course and being very, very excited about well-being, neurodiversity and all the leading edge stuff on inclusive design, which is really, really exciting. I think the key thing I would like to say today, because I'm speaking really on behalf of the facilities management sector and managing buildings, is it's such a shame that we can't take a more holistic approach when we design a building. And by that I mean that if we design it just looking at the capital spend, we will end up with buildings that are quite restrictive. We will look at only the front end cost and we won't look at the whole life costing of running that building and operating it correctly and appropriately and inclusively. And what we then end up with is buildings that have to be adjusted. So under the Equality Act, which Jane mentioned, there is a part of that which is around reasonable adjustments, which is talking about the duty, which only relates to disability, about adjusting buildings retrospectively. That's really costly to do, and it doesn't lead to really sexy, good-looking, attractive and truly inclusive buildings. It leads to sort of bolt-ons that can be quite ugly at times. So for me, looking at that whole spend, whole cost situation is really, really helpful. And if we could only get people to consider that at the front end, then that would be the appropriate thing to do and to make everything better for everyone. And with that comes components of flexibility and adjustability. So if you can design it in adaptability from day one, we will have more robust building stock that can be repurposed. Many buildings get repurposed over their lifetime, so it will make that easier. So if I give an example of that, one of the big things for me that I often experience when I'm talking to facilities managers is that they have a very awkward task in getting people out of buildings. And this has been mentioned a couple of times already. The egress of people, the evacuation of people needs to be as seamless and as independent as possible, and needs to be really equal to getting people into buildings, and quite often that's not the case. Now I know that lifts can be a big spend item and they require space and so forth, but actually what you're building in there, if you have enough lifts and you have evacuation lifts and everything, you're building in the flexibility to use that building over its lifetime in so many different ways, which is so helpful. And it actually prolongs the shelf life of that building and does make it possible to repurpose it for different uses, which I think is a strong plus on the life costs of the building and the value in the marketplace. Really delighted that a couple of the speakers have mentioned things like cancer, stoma use, and many hidden disabilities, or no one should have to disclose their disability. We should be designing for everyone, and unfortunately it's often not the case. So the key things for me would be about education and training. I think having diversity in our teams that are doing the designs and the managing buildings really helps, and having that adaptable model in mind, so that a building isn't going to be just its entire lifetime. COVID has shown us that. I've been involved with some COVID publications and guidance on that around accessibility, and you can see that actually once you start triggering something like a one-way system, you actually need more lifts and different stairs and different entrances. So we need to build in some of that flexibility from day one, and I think that's going to be really helpful. So I think training, education, inclusive design is also about including disabled people and a diverse part of society as you go along. So co-design and certainly good stakeholder engagement. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Martin Burgess here. I'm an access consultant and also an active building control surveyor. Thanks to Jean there, and actually I'd agree there that certainly from my experience, it's all about educating building users, building managers, and those involved in buildings. But anyway, I'm going to try to be fairly short and sweet. I'm going to try and talk to you about inclusive design and the real challenge of actually trying to legislate for inclusive design in the built environment, which we find every day in applying the various legislation. I've got in front of me a copy of what a document you might find familiar, which is approved document M, which is the element that's cited in the building regulations. So I want to talk briefly about the interrelationship between Part M of the building regulations and the Equality Act itself, because they do interlink, but it's very challenging to actually get that to work well. If you find yourself a copy of approved document M, the volume 2 version, which talks about non-domestic buildings, there's good information in the introduction there about the relationship between Part M of the building regulations and the Equality Act. So I'd advocate having a read of that. What can make things challenging is that both the building regulations themselves and the Equality Act are both functional in nature. And whilst there's lots and lots of supporting guidance, there are different mechanisms for potential enforcement between the building regulations and the Equality Act, which I'll touch on shortly. When you actually consider Part M of the building regulations, the actual regulation itself states reasonable provisions shall be made for people to gain access and use the building and its facilities. Supporting the building regulations are the approved documents, which if followed would tend to demonstrate compliance with the functional regulations. Approved document M itself covers access to and use of buildings. However, there's no obligation to follow these guidelines if there are alternatives available. Typically, British Standard BS 8300 provides more comprehensive guidance, and there are numerous other documents such as building bulletins for schools, specialised guidance on sports facilities, historic buildings, etc., all valid for use for demonstrating compliance with that functional requirement of the building regulations. However, that approved document M would always be used as a benchmark for an absolute minimum standard to meet building regulations. Due to potential for ambiguity, you can probably see the importance, therefore, of access statements or design and access statements when demonstrating technical compliance of schemes. An access statement can be used to demonstrate the package of measures, or better still, the inclusive design measures proposed for a development to meet and exceed, indeed, Part M of the building regulations. Finally, on this little bit, enforcement of the building regulations is via the Building Act, and that is enforced by the local authority. It's important to remember that when we come on to talk about the Equality Act shortly. It's also important to note that you can actually, theoretically, have a 100% technically compliant building under Part M of the building regulations, but still discriminate under the Equality Act in the way that you use and manage the buildings. This is because the Equality Act itself is effectively human rights legislation as opposed to specific building legislation. Once a project has been completed under the building regulations, there is no ongoing control from the building control body, and effectively it falls under the remit of the Equality Act. So those responsible for running and managing buildings with consideration to all the occupants, but particularly members of the public or visitors, into respect of their ongoing obligations to ensure they have equitable access to the building, but more importantly, to the facilities and the services that they offer. So a simple example would be perhaps a building that may have one single passenger lift, complying, of course, with approved document M, of the building regulations, allowing the building to be technically compliant, but failing to maintain that lift so it's not available for general use means that access to upper floors would be unavailable, and therefore there's the risk of a successful claim for discrimination under the Equality Act. Conversely, on the other side of the coin, it could be argued that a building that is not 100% technically compliant could still provide equitable access to the services and facilities by offering compensatory management procedures and auxiliary aids. This could be, for example, to an existing public building, such as a museum, which is of historic interest, limiting scope for practical changes to, for example, door widths or stepped access. However, the emphasis here is under the Equality Act, the principle of within reason is that all services and facilities should be accessible and allow flexibility for those providing services, and they should consider how best to optimise access and use. It does get obviously a bit more intricate than this in practice, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an understanding of the principles between the technical building regulations and then the ongoing obligations of the Equality Act. Just to quickly finish off, just some issues that are cropping up now with technical changes to legislation. I expect many of you may be familiar now that a changing places facilities is now coming into the England building regulations next year. I think they're already in there for Scotland. They will be required to larger public buildings such as entertainment buildings, shopping centres, hospitals and larger transport buildings themselves. Guidance is being issued or has been issued, but the important thing to note is that these changing place facilities will apply to any building regulation application that's submitted after the 1st of January next year, which is not very far away. And even more importantly, they will apply to any scheme that hasn't actually started on site and after the 1st of March 2021. So many schemes that may be on the drawing board or being designed now may get caught by this requirement if they do not start on site before March 2021. So I think that's something to be worth being aware of. And finally, a quick one on a housing consultation paper that was issued last month in England to look at enhancements to approved document M, which is the volume 1 for housing. This is seeking views and feedbacks on the provision in approved document M with consideration to effectively seeking all new housing to meet what we call category 2, which is accessible and adaptable housing, similar to the requirements in the London plan for category 2 housing and category 3 housing on a split of 90% to 10%. But I'll stop at that point and perhaps we'll be able to catch up with any questions on that a little bit later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And some of the items I've taken away already is misnomer to say inclusion is expensive, far more than functionality, legislation or guidance, and softer features and push the boundaries. Now we know we've got some incredible question and answers, questions to ask the panel today. And there's one here from Christina that I'm going to read out and hand over to the panel. So all tips on how we can incorporate all issues discussed today into architectural education would be most welcome. At Liverpool, we are already discussing a student society in the area of health and well-being, but any assistance would be much appreciated.
Hello, yes, I don't know if I'm oh good, I'm back in now. Yes, I've been having problems actually. So yeah, so I haven't done my presentation, but yes, when I was doing the BEPO project, the Paralympic Legacy project with government, we produced a teaching and briefing guide to help universities to look at how to teach the teachers inclusive design, if you like, how to really embed inclusive design in the teaching programme, because what we were trying to do is get RIBA and all the institutions to change their accreditation criteria, so you could only do an architectural course if inclusive design was effectively taught. So it's on the Construction Industry Council website. Do have a look at that. And apologies because I've just missed the last 20 minutes trying to get back in. So, so Avril, I guess I'm too late now to do my presentation, or do you want me to do my talk?
I think it'd be wonderful to hear from you if you can. And yes, we've had some fun. You've seen my signs. It'd be wonderful for you to join in. Thank you.
Okay. a bit challenged here today because I could talk for 2 hours and I've been given 5 minutes, which isn't nearly long enough. But I started off as a town planner and specialised in inclusive design, working for the Greater London Authority. I'm going to whiz through, so apologies if I go too fast, but I'm very happy to share my talk. And also there's my book, and I'm doing some CPD training for RIBA at the moment. So lots of ways of engaging with me. So 40 years ago, following the publication of a report written by disabled people called Can Disabled People Go Where You Go?, access for disabled people was enshrined in planning legislation. Local planning authorities were required to draw the attention of developers to the need to provide access and facilities for disabled people. How we plan, design and manage our built environment has gradually changed over the years. We've moved away from the special for the disabled approach towards a more inclusive attitude that puts all people at the heart of the design process, recognises diversity and difference, and plans for choice, independence and dignity. Inclusive design is now clearly articulated in the National Planning Policy Framework, in the Government's Planning Practice Guide, and given the plethora of technical standards, exemplar case studies and the availability of technical expertise, there is no longer any excuse for not getting it right. So why is inclusion still not business as usual? Because it's not. Ask any disabled person. The Lifetime Home Standards were published in 1991, yet 30 years later, new homes are still being built with steps to the front door and a downstairs toilet that is not wheelchair accessible. Accessible housing is still only an option in the building regulations. We do not live in a fair or equitable society. The evidence presented to the Women and Equality Select Committee inquiry into disability in the built environment in 2017 concluded that the challenges disabled people face in accessing homes, buildings and public spaces constitutes an unacceptable diminution of quality of life and equality. So what are we doing wrong? Are the minimum standards not robust enough? Are we just tinkering around the edges, pretending to make buildings accessible when they are clearly not? For example, a door beside a revolving door is not inclusive. Or is it a failure of the whole planning system? It's easy to write planning policy, to draft an access statement, to comply with minimum standards, but this is proving to be ineffective. Is the answer to completely overhaul the planning system and start again, as the recent government consultation is suggesting? Or are we just not listening to disabled people? Do we need to revise how we engage with people with lived experience of environmental barriers and recognise that many people live with the consequences of a disabling environment every single day of their lives? They know what the barriers are and have experience of what works and what doesn't. Effective co-production with disabled people at an early stage does work. Or is it a lack of proper implementation and enforcement? 10 years of austerity has decimated local authority services, and today there is a chronic shortage of planners with inclusive design skills. The increase in permitted development rights is building the slums of the future. Surely more staff resources, better enforcement of existing planning controls and higher minimum standards is what will deliver the accessible homes we so desperately need. The RIBA Plan of Works now recognises that inclusive design has to start at the very beginning of every development, at stage 0, and that purple thread, those inclusive design principles that help ensure disabled people are given equal, dignified and independent access, must be part of every stage of the development process, from the outline concept and briefing stage right through to completion and in-use management. If we leave out any stage, if we fail to use the inclusion lens as we design and build, if we are complacent, we will compromise. And compromise can lead to exclusion, and exclusion leads to discrimination. So what can you do? Well, here are some suggestions. Reject the government proposals to overhaul the planning system completely. Systematic change is definitely needed, but not at the expense of an effective and well-resourced planning system. Endorse the government proposal to amend Part M of the building regulations and make accessible housing mandatory for all new homes. Plan how you are going to achieve an inclusive building from the very beginning. Don't wait to be told that your scheme does not comply with the local plan or with those very minimum building regulation standards. Part M is a safety net, it's the baseline, it does not deliver inclusion. Improve your inclusive design knowledge and skills. The enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. Know what you don't know and when to ask for help from the experts. Achieve the highest standards of access and inclusion in all your projects by knowing, using and implementing the best practice standards in British Standard BS 8300. But keep up to date as standards change and continue to learn throughout your career. Don't just consult with disabled people. Co-production is much more powerful. It's about being together on equal terms. If you have a disabled boss or a disabled colleague, you see everybody as equal. Different, but equal. It's not about them and us. We are all in this together. Refuse to work with clients who do not embrace inclusion, who don't recognise the business benefits or who minimise the consequences of a discriminatory attitude. Challenge discrimination and help your client to recognise the value of inclusive buildings. Implement the essential principles for built environment professionals, an initiative from the government's Paralympic Legacy BEPE project, and make them part of your company's professional code of conduct. Support RIBA's inclusion charter, but remember that making a promise to change your behaviour is easy. It's much harder to actually make that change. It's actions that count, not thoughts or promises. Please challenge yourself, examine your attitude and your behaviour, and maybe change how you work and practice inclusive design. We can collectively and individually affect real change now. Thank you for listening.
Hi, Julie. I'm absolutely delighted we managed to get you in. So thank you so much for that. I know we're running out of time, but I'm going to sneak in one more question. This question is, with the housing crisis currently in the UK, do we need to start designing more inclusive houses? Is there a magic module which is flexible for most people, disabled or not? Or should a larger range of houses types be focused on and be built? For example, houses specifically created for wheelchair users.
Thank you. Just to let everybody know, there is an accessible housing standards review at the moment. So there is consultation going on between now and December for people to input in their ideas around improvements that need to be made to accessible housing stock. So I'd encourage you all to have a look at that, because it will help shape Part M building standards. In terms of the flexibility of housing stock, I'd again encourage us not just to think about designing for wheelchair access. Yes, as a bare minimum, we should be designing enough space and circulation for wheelchair users, but we should also be looking at better future-proofing our housing stock to suit the needs of everybody, in particular, everybody with a range of different conditions, and with the demographic shift going on in our country, particularly for older people, we see an awful lot of demand for intuitive controls and step-free access and better access in bathrooms and kitchens, particularly for older people. So all of this needs to feed into those housing standards.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I've been allowed to sneak in one more question, which I'm very excited about. I know there's some excellent ones in there, including talking about new technologies like virtual reality to help simulate visual impairment and hearing loss to help architects with their design. One of the questions I'd like to ask is, inclusive design should be seen as a key aspect of sustainable design. A building not sustainable if it doesn't work for people. How can we encourage sustainability movement to encourage with this more? Any volunteers for this one?
Shall I join in?
Wonderful, thank you.
Oh, Avril, yeah.
I think it's one of those areas that people forget about, the fact that inclusion is sustainability. Sorry, am I in now? Sustainability is about producing something that's future-proofed. And in fact, I'm going through a similar exercise on my own house at the moment. I'm building my own house and redesigning it, and designing it such to deal with any changes that may happen. And for my view is that any building that's supposedly sustainable should also be inclusive. You should not have to go in and start changing things. And it is, sustainability is on the agenda, on the mind of everybody. So hopefully we can try and instill the fact that inclusivity is part of that agenda. We should be able to get far more inclusive buildings built. Anybody else got any comments?
It's Martin here. Actually, I was wondering whether, as part of BREEAM, which obviously looks at those sort of issues, should that not be looked at as getting some degree of inclusivity into that assessment?
Can I come in there, Avril?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the definition of sustainability, the economic, social and environmental aspects, all absolutely embed inclusive design into those definitions. I mean, none of them will work if it's not inclusive. And I think part of the problem is that we have sidelined disability and accessibility into a little niche, and actually what we need to do is to bring it much more into the mainstream as a part of how we think and how we work. We really need to get it and embed it properly, otherwise we will continue to make the same mistakes we've been making for the last 30 years. And yes, BRIAM have started to look at that, and actually there is a bit in my book around some of the technical standards and around using expertise in some of the BRIAM standards, but I think there is a lot more that can be done in those BRIAM standards. But I think part of the way forward is to recognise that we have to start at the very beginning with those experts, with disabled people on board from day one, from stage 0. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Lesta, Jane, Zoe, Julie, Ed, Martin and Jean. I am incredibly grateful for your time, for your technology patience, and everyone out there for your patience as well. I want to share that to look out soon for our EDI plans on disability and accessibility. These will be coming out soon. And it's very important that we finish with a pledge. And for me, a pledge has got to be something that I can action and I can be accountable for. So I'm obviously going to lean on the technology angle, and it's very much to do with assistive technologies. It will be available to all staff who need it as part of our consumable budget with no long approval process. It is extremely important to create equity across our workforce and to level the playing field to enable all staff to do their best. So I want to thank the speakers and the panelists for the whole week. It's been incredible. And I am going to sneak in for everybody that has been organising and that is behind the scenes. You have been doing a sterling job, and thank you so, so much. Without further ado, have a wonderful afternoon and happy Friday, everybody.